I want you to pause for a moment and really sit with the gravity of what is unfolding right now, because this is not just another diplomatic meeting between world leaders, not just another state visit that will generate ceremonial photo opportunities and joint statements about cooperation on global challenges. And certainly not just another example of middle powers diversifying their international relationships to reduce dependence on single dominant partners. What we are witnessing is Chinese President Xi Jinping and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney holding substantive negotiations in Beijing 1 minute ago, just 48 hours before Carney is scheduled to meet with President Trump in Washington to discuss escalating trade tensions. And the timing is so deliberate, the symbolism is so transparent, and the strategic implications are so profound that it represents the most significant geopolitical signal Canada has sent to the United States since the Suez Crisis of 1956, when Canada broke with American policy and effectively ended British global power. I have spent decades watching power from the inside. First, as a Republican operative who helped construct the institutional frameworks governing American hemispheric policy and great power competition. Then, as a constitutional lawyer who has litigated cases about executive authority, foreign commerce, and the constitutional boundaries of presidential power in international relations. And I can tell you with absolute certainty, what Mark Carney is doing right now in Beijing is not a scheduling coincidence or a routine diplomatic engagement that happens to precede American negotiations. It is a calculated strategic signal designed to demonstrate to Washington that Canada has alternatives to American economic partnership, that those alternatives include the world's second largest economy, led by America's primary strategic competitor, and that continued American threats and ultimatums will accelerate Canadian reorientation toward partnerships that reduce American leverage to levels where threats become strategically counterproductive for Washington to make. So I want you to ask yourself 3 questions. First, what happens when a Canadian Prime Minister deliberately schedules a high-profile meeting with Xi Jinping immediately before critical negotiations with the American president, creating optics that unmistakably signal Canada is exploring Chinese partnership as an alternative to American economic integration that has defined the bilateral relationship for 80 years? Second, what happens when that meeting produces a joint statement released by both governments 1 minute ago, announcing $47 billion in new economic agreements, including Chinese investment in Canadian critical minerals, expanded energy partnerships, and technology cooperation that directly competes with sectors where the United States has been demanding Canadian alignment with American strategic priorities? And third, what happens when Carney, whose credibility with global financial markets and whose understanding of economic leverage exceeds virtually any political leader currently in office, uses the Beijing meeting to demonstrate to Trump that threats designed to force Canadian compliance instead produce exactly what American strategic policy has spent decades trying to prevent: significant Chinese economic presence in a country sharing a 5,500-mile border with the United States? These are not theoretical questions. These are being answered right now in real time in emergency sessions at the White House, where officials are calculating how to respond to Canadian actions that have transformed what they assumed would be a negotiation where the United States held overwhelming leverage into a situation where Canada has demonstrated credible alternatives that make American threats strategically risky, in financial markets where traders are repricing North American economic relationships based on recognition that assumptions underlying continental integration no longer reflect political realities, and in capitals around the world where American allies are watching to see whether middle powers can successfully use great power competition to reduce American leverage when American pressure becomes intolerable. For more than 4 decades, since China's economic reforms under Deng Xiaoping, created opportunities for Western economic engagement, and since the end of the Cold War, eliminated ideological barriers to Sino-Western partnerships, the United States had maintained a fundamental strategic principle regarding Chinese economic relationships with Western Hemisphere countries. Limited commercial engagement was acceptable and inevitable given China's economic rise, but deep strategic partnerships that gave China political influence or that created dependencies, reducing American leverage, were threats to American hemispheric dominance that needed to be prevented through American diplomatic pressure and through ensuring that American economic relationships remained more valuable than Chinese alternatives. The principle had been maintained through multiple administrations from both parties with remarkable consistency. Democratic and Republican presidents agreed that China's growing economic power globally was inevitable, and that attempting to prevent all Chinese commercial activity in the Americas was neither possible nor necessary. But they also agreed that the United States needed to use its own economic relationships and its diplomatic influence to ensure that no major Western Hemisphere country became sufficiently dependent on Chinese economic ties that Beijing could use those ties to pressure governments in ways that complicated American interests. The approach had been largely successful for decades, particularly regarding Canada, where despite growing Canada-China trade, the overwhelming integration with the United States meant that Canadian foreign policy always weighed American preferences far more heavily than Chinese interests. Canada did approximately $100 billion in annual bilateral trade with China, which made China Canada's second largest trading partner. But that paled compared to the $800 billion in Canada-US trade and the deep supply chain integration that meant Canadian prosperity was fundamentally tied to American economic health. That asymmetry gave Washington enormous confidence that whatever tactical disagreements emerged with Ottawa, strategic Canadian alignment with American priorities was assured because the economic costs of seriously damaging relationships with Washington were prohibitive for any Canadian government. That confidence was reinforced by Canadian political culture and by the institutional relationships built over generations of alliance cooperation. Canada was a fellow liberal democracy with similar values, a founding member of NATO, a Five Eyes intelligence partner, and a country whose security had been guaranteed by American power since World War II. The relationship had depth that transcended transactional trade calculations. Multiple generations of Canadian and American officials had worked together, had attended the same schools, had developed personal relationships that created trust, extending beyond specific policy agreements. The infrastructure of cooperation, from NORAD aerospace defense integration to coordinated border management to intelligence sharing to joint military operations, represented decades of accumulated institutional knowledge and mutual confidence that neither government would take actions fundamentally threatening to the other's core interests. That institutional foundation meant that even when Canadian governments adopted policies Washington strongly opposed, like Canadian opposition to the Iraq War in 2003, the disagreements occurred within a framework of alliance relationships that both sides understood would persist and that created incentives for maintaining cooperation on other issues. The system worked because both countries understood that the relationship had strategic value, extending beyond any specific disagreement, that preserving the alliance framework served interests that transcended particular policy disputes, and that neither government would exploit the other's vulnerabilities in ways that would fundamentally damage the relationship. American administrations understood they couldn't push Canada too aggressively without activating nationalist resistance that would be counterproductive. Canadian governments understood they couldn't diverge too radically from American strategic priorities without risking access to American markets and security cooperation that Canadian prosperity and security depended on. The mutual understanding created stability even when tensions were significant. But that stability, that assumption that shared strategic interests and accumulated institutional relationships would prevent either side from taking actions that fundamentally threaten the other's core interests, has been systematically destroyed over the past 6 months by an American administration that treated Canadian sovereignty as subordinate to American demands, and that apparently believed the institutional relationship was sufficiently durable that it could absorb unlimited American pressure without fracturing. The threats had been comprehensive, public, and relentless in ways that violated every principle of alliance management that had governed the relationship for generations. 25% tariffs threatened on Canadian goods unless Canada accepted American demands on issues ranging from border security to defense spending to data localization. Public statements characterizing Canada as taking advantage of the United States, as being responsible for American economic problems, as requiring discipline through economic pressure. American support for Quebec's separatism as leverage to destabilize a Canadian government that refused to comply with American ultimatums. Each action individually would have been serious violation of alliance norms. Cumulatively, they convinced Canadian political elites across the partisan spectrum that the institutional relationship could no longer be relied upon to constrain American behavior, that American administrations under Trump would exploit Canadian vulnerabilities without regard for alliance preservation, and that continued overwhelming dependence on American economic relationships created existential risks to Canadian sovereignty that justified pursuing alternatives regardless of short-term costs or geopolitical complications. For Mark Carney, whose background as former governor of the Bank of England and Bank of Canada gave him sophistication in reading geopolitical dynamics and in understanding how economic relationships translate into political leverage, the situation required a response that would fundamentally alter the strategic calculus in Washington. Diplomatic protests had been ineffective. Economic retaliation targeting American political vulnerabilities had produced temporary American retreats, but hadn't changed the underlying dynamic where the administration treated Canada as subordinate. Public statements defending Canadian sovereignty had satisfied domestic audiences, but hadn't moderated American behavior. What was required was a demonstration that continued American threats would produce exactly the outcome that American strategic policy had spent decades trying to prevent: significant Chinese economic presence in Canada that would reduce American leverage and that would give Beijing influence in a country whose geography and whose institutional relationships had always made it essentially an extension of American strategic space. And that demonstration needed to be dramatic enough and timed precisely enough that it would be impossible for Washington to miss the message. Threats designed to force Canadian compliance were instead forcing Canada toward partnerships with America's primary strategic competitor. Within minutes of the meeting between Xi and Carney concluding, the effects began cascading through diplomatic and economic systems in ways that revealed just how carefully the entire sequence had been choreographed and just how significant the agreements reached in Beijing were. The joint statement released simultaneously by Chinese and Canadian governments was remarkable for its scope and for how directly it addressed areas where the United States had been demanding Canadian alignment with American strategic priorities. The statement announced $47 billion in new economic agreements to be implemented over 5 years, with $23 billion committed in the first 18 months. The investment focus was explicitly on sectors that the United States considered strategically sensitive and where Washington had been pressuring Canada to limit Chinese access. $19 billion in Chinese investment in Canadian critical minerals extraction and processing, including lithium, cobalt, nickel, and rare earth elements essential for technology manufacturing and for green energy transitions. The investment would give Chinese state-owned enterprises significant ownership stakes in Canadian mining operations and would secure long-term supply contracts directing Canadian critical minerals to Chinese manufacturers rather than to American or allied production. The United States had been pressuring Canada for 2 years to restrict Chinese access to Canadian critical minerals, arguing that Chinese control over supply chains for strategic materials threatened Western security. The announcement made clear Canada was rejecting that pressure and was instead deepening Chinese access to exactly the resources Washington wanted restricted. $14 billion in expanded energy partnerships, including Chinese investment in Canadian LNG export terminals on the Pacific coast, and in infrastructure connecting Canadian oil and gas production to Asian markets. The investment would accelerate Canadian energy reorientation away from exclusive American markets toward diversified global exports where China would be the primary customer. The United States had viewed Canadian energy as essentially captive to American demand because existing infrastructure directed Canadian production predominantly south. The Chinese investment would build infrastructure directing Canadian energy west to Asian markets, reducing American leverage that had been based on assumption that Canada had no alternatives to American buyers. $8 billion in technology cooperation agreements, including joint ventures in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and telecommunications infrastructure. The cooperation would occur in precisely the sectors where the United States had been demanding that allies exclude Chinese companies on security grounds. Canada joining Chinese technology development efforts represented direct rejection of American demands for technological decoupling from China. The remaining $6 billion allocated to financial sector integration, agricultural partnerships, and manufacturing cooperation that would deepen Canada-China economic ties across multiple industries. When a factory stops, there's no narrative that fixes it. But when a G7 country sharing the world's longest border with the United States signs $47 billion in economic agreements with America's primary strategic competitor 48 hours before meeting with the American president, you're watching geopolitical realignment happen through actions so deliberate that they constitute one of the clearest signals in modern diplomatic history. The joint statement included language that was clearly designed to emphasize the meeting's timing and its relationship to Canada-US tensions. Xi and Carney expressed satisfaction that deepening Sino-Canadian partnership creates opportunities for both countries to pursue independent foreign policies based on national interests rather than on pressures from third parties. The reference was transparent. Carney stated that Canada values partnerships with all major economies and will not accept that economic relationships with any single country, however important historically, should constrain Canadian sovereignty or Canadian pursuit of beneficial relationships with other partners. The language was diplomatic, but the message was unmistakable. Canada was explicitly rejecting American demands that Canadian economic policy align with American strategic priorities, and was doing so by deepening partnerships with the country Washington viewed as primary threat. As details of the Beijing agreement circulated, something extraordinary started happening in how different constituencies responded, revealing how effectively Carney had positioned the China partnership as defense of Canadian sovereignty rather than as anti-American alignment. Within Canada, reaction was overwhelmingly positive in ways that demonstrated how thoroughly American threats had transformed Canadian public opinion. Polling conducted within hours of the announcement showed 69% of Canadians supported deepening economic ties with China, if doing so reduced Canadian dependence on American markets that had proven vulnerable to American political pressure. The support was remarkable given that Canadian public opinion had been skeptical of China for years due to concerns about human rights, about Chinese detention of Canadian citizens during previous diplomatic crises, and about Chinese political interference. But 18 months of American threats had convinced most Canadians that reducing American economic leverage was more important than concerns about Chinese partnerships. And Carney's framing that the agreements defended Canadian sovereignty against American coercion resonated powerfully. Canadian business sectors that might have opposed agreements giving Chinese state-owned enterprises significant presence in Canadian industries instead expressed support or remained carefully neutral. Canadian mining companies welcomed Chinese investment that would accelerate development. Canadian energy producers supported infrastructure that would provide access to Asian markets. Even sectors that had historically been most supportive of American ties recognized that continued dependence on American markets created vulnerabilities that American behavior had demonstrated were intolerable. Opposition parties found themselves unable to criticize without appearing to advocate for subordination to American demands that Canadian voters now overwhelmingly opposed. The conservative opposition offered muted concerns about Chinese influence while acknowledging the need to reduce American leverage. The NDP strongly supported the agreements as defense against American economic imperialism. Carney had successfully made the China partnership politically unassailable by framing it as sovereignty defense, making any Canadian who opposed it appear as supporting American subordination of Canada. In Washington, the reaction revealed shock and belated recognition that American threats had produced exactly the strategic outcome American policy had worked for decades to prevent. National Security Council officials convened emergency sessions to assess implications. The agreements meant significant Chinese economic presence in a country sharing the longest land border with the United States. They meant Chinese state-owned enterprises controlling supply chains for critical minerals that American technology and defense industries depended on. They meant Canadian energy being redirected toward Chinese markets, reducing American access to resources that American refineries and utilities had treated as reliably available. They meant a G7 ally and founding NATO member, deepening partnerships with America's primary strategic competitor in ways that would give Beijing leverage over Canadian policy and that would complicate American efforts to maintain technological and economic competition with China. Every element represented a strategic setback for American interests. And all of it was happening because American threats had convinced Canada that reducing American dependence justified accepting risks and costs of Chinese partnership. Within the White House, according to reporting that emerged rapidly, there was intense internal debate about how to respond. Some officials argued for immediate escalation, implementing threatened tariffs and imposing costs that would force Canada to reconsider the Chinese agreements. Others warned that escalation would accelerate exactly the Canadian reorientation toward China that escalation was meant to prevent, and that Carney's meeting with Trump in 48 hours provided opportunity for diplomatic resolution if Trump moderated his approach. The debate revealed that the administration had no prepared strategy for the situation their own threats had created, and that they were improvised responses to Canadian actions that caught them completely by surprise, despite those actions being entirely predictable consequences of American behavior. What makes this moment particularly devastating for American strategic interests is understanding how Carney's Beijing meeting fundamentally transforms the leverage dynamics in the upcoming Washington negotiations, and why American threats that might have worked before the China agreements are now strategically unusable. For 6 months, American negotiating strategy had assumed that Canadian economic dependence on American markets was so overwhelming that threats would eventually force Canadian compliance because Canada had no viable alternatives. The assumption was that Canada might resist initially to satisfy domestic political pressures, might implement symbolic retaliation to demonstrate independence, but would ultimately accommodate American demands because the economic costs of serious conflict with the United States exceeded any benefit of defending positions that Washington found unacceptable. That assumption was based on accurate reading of economic asymmetry, but on catastrophic misunderstanding of political dynamics in democratic systems and catastrophic ignorance of how Canadian access to Chinese partnership could transform the leverage calculation. Carney's Beijing agreements don't eliminate Canadian economic interests in maintaining good American relations. Canada will still benefit enormously from continued American market access. But the agreements create credible alternatives that make American threats strategically risky for Washington in ways they weren't previously. You can't threaten to restrict Canadian access to American markets when Canada has demonstrated it can redirect significant trade toward Chinese markets through agreements that are already signed and that include Chinese financing, ensuring implementation will proceed. You can't demand Canadian compliance on strategic issues when non-compliance will push Canada further into partnerships with your primary competitor that give that competitor exactly the hemispheric presence your strategic policy has worked for decades to prevent. This affects American ability to maintain technological competition with China when allies provide Chinese companies access to critical minerals and to technology cooperation that American policy had assumed would be restricted. It affects American energy security when Canadian resources are redirected toward Chinese markets through infrastructure that won't reorient back toward American buyers, even if American policy changes. It affects American strategic position when countries sharing American borders deepen partnerships with American competitors in ways that create complications for border security, for intelligence operations, and for military planning. It affects American diplomatic credibility when the closest ally chooses partnership with America's primary competitor over accommodation to American demands. The abstraction of geopolitical competition becomes concrete when American technology companies face critical mineral shortages because Canadian supplies are contracted to Chinese manufacturers. When American refineries face supply disruptions because Canadian crude flows to Asian markets. When American intelligence operations are complicated because Allied cooperation has deteriorated due to American behavior that allies concluded made American partnership intolerable. The tragedy is this was entirely avoidable and was explicitly predicted by everyone with basic understanding of alliance management and great power competition. If the administration had understood that threatening allies would activate domestic political dynamics, making accommodation impossible, and would create incentives for allies to seek alternatives, they would have known the threats would backfire. If they had recognized that geopolitical competition with China meant that threatened allies could find alternative partners who would welcome opportunities to reduce American influence, they would have maintained the diplomatic approach that preserved Allied dependence. If they had studied how previous American administrations managed disagreements with Canada and other allies without threatening the fundamental relationships, they would have understood that influence requires making cooperation appear beneficial rather than coerced. Instead, every decision maximized short-term pressure while creating the conditions where Canada could and would pursue the Chinese partnership that American strategic interests required preventing. The people paying the price aren't the officials who designed this catastrophic approach. They're American workers whose jobs depend on North American integration that's fragmenting. They're American companies that depended on Canadian resources now being redirected toward Chinese markets. They're American security officials dealing with Chinese presence in North America that American policy spent decades preventing. They're future generations inheriting a strategic environment where American alliance system has been voluntarily destroyed through incompetence. 1 minute ago, Xi Jinping and Mark Carney concluded negotiations that fundamentally transform North American geopolitics and that demonstrate how American threats against sophisticated allies produce exactly the outcomes American strategy should prevent. In 48 hours, Carney meets Trump. The Beijing agreements ensure that meeting occurs with leverage dynamics completely transformed from what Washington assumed, and the damage to American strategic position will compound for decades.